But first things first, we are going to be diving into some local issues before we hit on that big international one. Although before we dive into that, I do want to kind of give a little bit of content heads up, I guess. Well, first of all, as always, the following thoughts, views, and opinions are not necessarily those of 89.1 WIDR or Western Michigan University, no matter how dope or insightful they may in fact turn out to be. And I think that's particularly important with this issue, sorry, with today's episode, because I'm going to be talking about some issues that are very controversial, and I'm especially going to be giving some opinions and analysis that, well, in particular, a lot of mainstream Western media does not like, and have actively gotten people, more important than me, booted off of campuses and such. So hopefully I'll also have a show after this, but I think you can tell when we get to speak to on the Israel-Palestine conflict, I'm going to be giving out some harsh truths that the Western media is not, and hopefully that won't get me into trouble. We'll see. Um, in any case, before we get into all that, I gotta find my right words. Oh, here it is. Okay. Before we get into all that, we've got some local issues that we want to talk about. And we're going to start by kind of talking about this bill that is going through the Michigan House. And so we're going to actually start with a little bit of good news. It looks like the tireless efforts of at least some organizers and activists here in the state of Michigan are paying off, and we want to highlight the fruits of their labor on our program today. So this is from MLive. Homeless Bill of Rights would protect against theft, arrest in public spaces. And there's been a lot of many coalitions working around this. Most recently, we talked a little bit with the folks at We the People Michigan and the No Rent Michigan Coalition about what they've worked on. And it ties in a little bit to some of their work as well. So kind of give them a special shout out. But here's the gist of it. And this was written by Ben Orner, again from MLive, published October 6th. Oops, I don't have my mic in front of my face. Michigan lawmakers are taking first steps on a major piece of civil rights legislation to address issues of high housing costs and institute protections for renters. House Bill 4919, the Homeless Bill of Rights, has been receiving its first hearings in the Capitol as Representative Emily Devendorf from Lansing guides it through a legislature that has a sympathetic but slim Democratic majority. The goal of her bill, she told a House subcommittee on Thursday, is to create a bare minimum by establishing a measure of humanity for unhoused residents. It ensures, regardless of someone's housing status, equal access to public services, including rights to personal property, to emergency medical care, and to move freely in public spaces. Other core components include rights to equal treatment by state and municipal agencies for homeless youth to be enrolled in school and to freedom from discrimination in employment when lacking a permanent mailing address. Any of the examples where somebody could possibly be denied the services and spaces that we already have access to, they said, is a houseless person would be able to file a civil suit. More than 8,000 people were homeless on a given night in Michigan last year, according to a report from the National Alliance to End Homelessness. And more than 30,000 different people experienced homelessness in Michigan in all of 2021, the latest year the state has data. Homeless people suffer from stereotypes and assumptions, Dievendorf said, like behavior, dangerousness, and undesirability. Her bill ensures, for example, they can't be arrested for being in a park or have their belongings thrown away. Don't treat people like crap. You're not going to get sued, she said. Connecticut, Illinois, Puerto Rico, and Rhode Island have enacted similar legislation. And just to kind of pause and give this issue some local context, as many of you know, there's been a lot of activity here in the Kalamazoo area fighting for the rights of houseless residents. We go back to the summer of 2018, thinking about the houseless encampment, the Bronson Park Freedom Encampment that emerged in response to some very onerous potential city legislation that would have basically, did that old tactic of making loitering in the park illegal and stuff. Basically, these rules designed to punish people for existing in public, and that primarily targets houseless people. And there was a huge backlash to that ended up in a month-long encampment down in Bronson Park, very deliberate effort to make the issue of houselessness very visible. Near the end of it, several people got arrested, including at the time City Commissioner Shannon Sykes. And that question has persisted. There have been moves toward affordable housing, not nearly enough. It is very much a drop in the bucket. As we've said on the show here, it is the responsibility of the city of Kalamazoo to scale up its solutions to houselessness, not just do a little piece here and a little piece there, because it is a problem that is only going to increase in magnitude as the years keep on coming. And you really did see the callousness of the city government at play sometime later, think back to the fall of 2021 with the eviction of the Ampersea houseless encampment. And what's interesting about this bill to me is, talks about a houseless bill of rights and specifically about the right of houseless people and their personal property. We think back to that eviction, you had people given a 10-minute warning, had basically all of their life's belongings bulldozed by Kalamazoo Department of Public Safety. It's kind of a misnomer, in my opinion. They were actually endangering the public that day, the houseless public. Several people were arrested. We've talked about that situation on the show before. There was a lot of police brutality that happened that day as well. So that is a big reason why it's important that the work of activists throughout the years, whether it's been folks from the Freedom Encampment, these housing coalitions across the state that are emerging to tackle rent control and houselessness, among this whole basket of issues. It's important to point that out because it's bearing fruit, and we've at least got at least enough pressure has been put on people in Lansing to try to address it in a real and substantive way. I'm going to continue reading a bit from the article. Homelessness across the nation has fallen since the COVID-19 pandemic as safety net policies helped keep people housed. Wow, think about it. When you have a better social safety net, less people are houseless. What a crazy thought. But local activists say they're seeing increases. Again, we're seeing a little bit of a rebound. And by that, I mean, we had a couple of years there where, we got a little taste of that social safety net. We got the moratorium on rent. That's basically been over. And now the landlords and the property owning class is trying to play catch up. And we've been seeing a spike in evictions and also gentrification, jacking up rent, trying to get higher income people into certain areas, etc. We've got to take this bull by the horns, Lansing community activist William Walker told lawmakers. He's a powerful bull, he's been around for a long time, and he is growing. The longer we allow him to grow, the harder it's going to take him down. House Bill 4919 is a major part of the Democrats' effort this year to tackle housing discrimination and high rents. Divendorf told MLive in August she expected 15 to 20 bills on housing inequality this fall. Among the topics include clarifying tenants' rights to organize, requiring landlords pay for relocating tenants with red-tagged buildings deemed unsafe for occupancy, and establishing standard criteria for what is a safe and livable dwelling. There were also a couple of other housing-related bills heard last week. HB 4891 would require landlords to refund application fees for prospective tenants whose applications were denied. If a tenant doesn't get a refund, they could sue for $1,000 in damages. Landlords would not need to refund a background check fee if they gave the applicant a copy of the report. And this is actually a pretty depressingly common tactic of a lot of landlords who will basically just sit on a property, refuse to rent it out, and basically just collect these application fees over time. If you go on Zillow, trying to find an apartment, if you see, you can check and see how many times an apartment or a property has been applied for. And if it's in the hundreds or something, that's probably a landlord engaging in that nesting tactic of just basically sitting on a property without the intention of renting it out anytime soon anyway, and basically just collecting application fees. Again, this is why people like me say capitalism is not good when it comes to issues like housing. Housing should be a human right, not something that people can use as a swindle, basically, to gain passive income through no effort of their own. Going on, the subcommittee also advanced HB 4891. Yeah, oh, I just mentioned that. They also heard HB House Bill 4878, which would generally prevent landlords from considering a rental applicant's criminal record. That means their arrest record, any convictions as an adult or juvenile, and any participate in a diversion program. That's actually real good news, and it should be familiar for folks here in Kalamazoo because we actually passed our own local housing discrimination ordinance a couple of years back, thanks to the voters of Kalamazoo. And it looks like this would be a move to kind of broaden that out to the state level. And yeah, that's pretty much it with that article. But I did want to bring your attention to some at least some good moves being made at the state legislative level to deal with houselessness and housing rights. And again, as I often point out, anytime we see good news like this come out of Lansing, it is a direct result of intense grassroots efforts by people on the ground to make the politicians in Lansing do the right thing, finding receptive people, putting that pressure on, broadening support for bills like this. So we owe all of those activists from the Bronson Park Freedom Encampment to the people doing work with the Rent is Too Darn High coalition. We owe all of them an immense debt of gratitude for forcing this onto the legislative agenda. Again, if you want to read that full article, that is Homeless Bill of Rights would protect against theft, arrest in public spaces. That was published October 6th, written by Ben Orner. So our next story, this is going to be kind of a quick hit, but there's a lot of kind of dialogue, I guess, around extremism right now, and I think it might be interesting or important to point out that we still have a lot of our own homegrown extremism here in the state of Michigan. So this is kind of from the Saginaw area. Michigan man accused of threatening Gretchen Whitmer, LGBTQ plus people on YouTube to pursue insanity defense. A man accused of making public threats against LGBTQ plus people, the president, and Michigan's governor is to pursue an insanity defense in his federal trial. Defense attorney Robert J. Dunn, representing Randall R. Burka II, on September 20th filed a notice with U.S. District Court that he intends to rely on an insanity defense. In support, Dunn submitted a motion seeking to have Burka receive a psychological evaluation. Dunn wrote that Burka has a substantial mental health history and was involuntarily committed by the Saginaw County Probate Court in 2012. A grand jury in April indicted Burka on single counts of possession of firearm by a prohibited person and possession of an unregistered firearm. Because of that commitment to a mental health facility, he was prohibited from possessing guns. On February 20th, Burka allegedly posted a threat online to kill Governor Gretchen Whitmer, writing, "You could be like me and get guns and threaten to kill politicians. I'm more than willing to kill Whitmer, and I do live in Michigan. I'll assault her ugly face with my bullets." End quote. FBI agents arrested Randall Burka at his and his parents' home on Rose Island Road in Sibawang on March 9th, 2 days after they began investigating a person making threats on YouTube. The threats came to the FBI's attention after Google submitted it a tip to its National Threat Operations section, according to an affidavit penned by a special agent who investigates domestic terrorism. When the FBI began investigating, the YouTube account had a display name of "Kill All Federal Agents on Site and Hang Biden" with a URL of @KillTheFeds420. Well, you'd think somebody with 420 in their handle would be slightly more chill, but anyway. Subscriber information indicated the account was attributed to Michelle Burka. Agents determined that between February 18th and March 7th, the account published at least 14 posts stating a desire to kill the president, the governor, Democratic politicians in general, law enforcement, and LGBTQ plus people, and basically made a lot of really gross and violent and genocidal threats. And again, posting in all caps, Second Amendment, just cry, come and take it. I will kill any agents that come to the door. It turns out the agents did come to his door, and he did not follow through on any of those threats. Now, why do I bring up this story? I mean, it's a very familiar one. It's another kind of reactionary yahoo, if one will, shouting threats into the ether. Which is it's an unfortunate, sadly common story in this day and age. But I thought again, it ties into a couple of things that we talk about a lot on our show. One of those is the way that a lot of people, people can be very vulnerable to the type of propaganda we see from corporate media outlets like Fox News, OAN, or these maybe more mom and pop right-wing conspiracy blogs and vlogs that you'll find on YouTube. As this article mentioned, this is somebody with a prior mental health history of mental health issues, and those are the specific type of people that the Tucker Carlsons of the world, the Ben Shapiro's, the Alex Joneses sink their teeth into to get those eyeballs, get those clicks with really no thought, some of them do this deliberately, called stochastic terrorism. They are trying to inflame sections of their base to go out and commit violence. It's exactly the profile of this individual who is going to be incensed by the rhetoric of the right that's saying things like, making up crazy conspiracy things about Joe Biden. And by the way, there's a lot wrong with Joe Biden, but the stuff that the conspiratorial far right comes up with is pretty ridiculous. He's a neoliberal capitalist. That's bad enough. They again framing Democratic politicians as part of some pedophilic cabal, painting the LGBTQ plus community as inherently pedophilic. It causes these people who are already predisposed to bad mental health issues and violent impulses to direct that at a marginalized target. And again, it's good that this guy got found out. Again, I'm a leftist. I'm no friend of the FBI. FBI has its own blood on its hands when it comes to leftists, i.e. Fred Hampton. But it does look like, at least in this case, this guy was a bit too much of a loudmouth on social media, and he was discovered before he was able to actually hurt anybody in real life, which is a good thing. But it is just part and parcel of the kind of political environment we are currently in, where individuals like this, who are just being fed a steady stream of hate from their media sources, and some of them do act on it in really violent and horrendous ways. Too many examples to think of, you know, El Paso, you know, Aurora. It's said the list goes on and on and on and on. And while there are many people, probably on Fox News and in some of the more centrist media outlets like CNN, crowing about, terrorists in the West Bank and Gaza, we have our own homegrown terrorists here at home. That are, again, kind of follow that agenda of white supremacy. And these people are not actually being oppressed, but are being brainwashed into thinking that they are and following through with tremendous violence against innocent people. So again, you want to read more from that article. That is from MLive. Michigan man accused of threatening Whitmer, LGBTQ plus people on YouTube to pursue insanity defense. So we got one more local story that I wanted to hit on. This one is really important, and it goes back to a central theme we've had, which is, talking about our local pharmaceutical corporation, Pfizer, who's, again, just down the street on Portage Road. And I have been very critical of them in the past, and I continue to be so, because it is an example of, much like how our first story kind of shows you, this is why it's bad when housing is put into the hands of capitalists. This next story kind of digs into why it is bad when medicine is in the hands of capitalists. And the vaccine profiteering of the Pfizer Corporation continues in earnest. I guess even especially as the COVID-19 pandemic in many people's minds has receded into the background, which, just a reminder, COVID is still out there. It is still a much deadlier virus than, much of the media and the corporate coverage give it credit. I don't even know what the conspiratorial right is saying about it these days. Maybe Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos use the emergency broadcast system to trigger the vaccines to do something. I don't know. But the real central, the real conspiracy is the conspiracy of the Pfizer Corporation to keep the profits from the COVID vaccine private, to hold on their patents, slowing down the inoculation, immunization of the global public more broadly. And now that the government has receded from, having a direct role in facilitating, COVID treatment, they are stepping in to rake in even more profits. So this is an article from Prism. It was written by Laura Weiss, published on October 9th. The headline is, "Commercialization is making access to the new COVID vaccine more difficult." I'm going to read a little bit from this. The latest COVID-19 booster shot is now available to the public, but this time access is a bit more challenging. Sanho Tree, a drug policy expert in Washington, D.C., has found getting previous vaccine doses to be very orderly, but has made 5 attempts to get the vaccine. After making his first appointment at a CVS on the other side of the city, the closest place that was available, he waited for 45 minutes when the pharmacist came out looking overworked and ragged and apologetically told him there were no shots left. His following attempts were canceled via CVS's automated text messaging system. "It really sucked," he said. "From a public health standpoint, it's a disaster." I want to echo that with actually a personal anecdote. I tried to get the COVID booster recently myself. I'm a healthcare worker, so it's particularly important that I keep up with the booster shots. And I set up an appointment to get it at Meijer, And I show up the day of, and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm here to get my shots. And it is not until I'm literally in the room about to get, I also, just as an afterthought, I was like, oh, I might as well get my flu shot at the same time. Um, I was like, oh yeah, I'm also here for my booster shot. And they're like, oh, we don't have any yet. And I'm like, you, you, you couldn't have let me know before I came here. And I got a few suggestions and called around, and lo and behold, it it was like a really popular video game. Every store was out of stock. Now, that might be okay when you're talking about the new Smash Brothers, but when you're talking about the new COVID vaccine, yeah, it's kind of important that pharmacies have that on hand. So there's a reason this is happening, and the article kind of digs into this. While previous vaccine doses and boosters were purchased by the US government and distributed in community health centers, doctors' offices, and retail pharmacies, responsibility for the latest COVID-19 vaccine has shifted into the hands of private companies. Hmm. It says this is a free market at work, folks. This means that pharmaceutical giants Pfizer, yeah, and Moderna, the primary COVID-19 vaccine manufacturers, are contracting with individual insurance companies to sell the vaccine and distribute the doses. As a result of these supply issues in the first few weeks of the rollout, patients have faced problems with receiving their doses in retail pharmacies, while public health departments have reported delays in supplies and a dearth of information. Some people have been charged erroneously when the shot is supposed to be free for privately and publicly insured patients, with programs to temporarily help cover most costs for uninsured ones, particularly for children. But there have been delays in delivery for the children's dose formulation of the vaccine. And the 25 to 30 million Americans who do not have health insurance, disproportionately people of color and low income people, may still be charged for administration of the vaccine. So, again, the poorest people in America are going to be charged for a necessary vaccine. It's a sort of like de facto classist eugenics that is going on here. And I know that that might sound really extreme, but COVID-19 is a nasty little bug. Even if you're vaccinated, you really don't want to get it. It can have long-term health conditions, and being vaccinated can kind of keep you from getting into long-term hospitalization or death. But this is a wonky virus that has a wild and diverse range of side effects, and it is really just a sick aspect of the system that we are now putting this in the hands of people who are basically looking at the vaccine as where it makes the line go up or down on their spreadsheets. According to Leslie Ray, a psychotherapist in San Diego, accessing the new vaccine was remarkably different than what I had experienced previously. For each of her previous COVID vaccine doses, she'd been able to simply walk into the local Rite Aid. This time, she had to go to Rite Aid 3 times before there was sufficient stock, even though the government's online vaccine finder and Rite Aid's website suggested walk in doses would be available. At the time, the online scheduler didn't show any appointments until late in October. Though Ray was able to get her vaccines on September 25th, nearly 2 weeks after the vaccine was approved, the experience left a bad taste in her mouth. The government should still be arranging this, she said. Andra Cernavakis, a law student in Oakland, California, also had an unsettling experience trying to get the new vaccine. She went to get her vaccine at a local Walgreens the first day it was available on September 18th. But when she and other patients lined up for their dose, they received handouts about that vaccine that repeatedly referenced the bivalent dose, which was used to target last year's Omicron strains. The customers were alarmed and concerned they would receive the wrong vaccine, they explained. Health and Human Services Secretary Xavier Becerra has since met with representatives from major health insurance companies and retail pharmacies, promising that most hiccups have been cleared up and reaffirming that patients should not be charged for the shot. But patients are continuing to report problems, and the confusion and disorder of the rollout point to a lack of trust in the healthcare institutions and providers around COVID 19, which could contribute to a lack of receptiveness to vaccination altogether. Going down just a little bit, complicated billing and tough contract measures designed by pharmaceutical and insurance companies to maximize profits will likely replicate health inequalities that persist for uninsured people, lower income adults, and people of color. These same groups have borne some of the worst health impacts of the pandemic. People of color are always at the bottom of that access to health, said Cynthia Adnig, the co-founder of the BIPOC Equity Agency. In the spring of 2023, KFF concluded that disparities in the share that have received at least one COVID-19 vaccination dose have narrowed over time and reversed for Hispanic people. Despite this progress, a vaccination gap persists for Black people, and Black and Hispanic people are about half as likely as their white counterparts to have received an updated bivalent booster dose. Booster uptake rates are low across the board. While about 70% of Americans completed the primary series of vaccines, a paltry 17% reported getting bivalent boosters. Misinformation and confusion about waning immunity and inconsistent public messaging have led many to believe that they do not need additional doses, even though vaccine efficacy wanes over time. Others are simply, quote unquote, done with COVID 19. I think as a society, people are intentionally putting themselves as far away from any COVID speak as possible so they can live in their delusional wall that everything is okay. And that's another really important thing to point out, folks. This virus is still out there, especially for people who are immunocompromised or have other health care issues. This is a looming and deadly threat every day to them. And the refusal to get vaccinated or taking other protective measures is a bit of a slap in the face to folks out there living with those type of conditions. So again, if y'all there's a lot more to this article. If you want to read it yourself, you can find it on Prism. Also available from Truthout. Article is by Laura Weiss. Commercialization is making access to the new COVID vaccine more difficult. All right, I think we're going to take a quick little break. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. We also have a YouTube page where you can find our content as well as our Media Cyphers Kalamazoo podcast. You can listen to our show at your convenience any time of the week. Probably hey, maybe you could put it on the speaker while you're in the back room of the kitchen or whatever workplace you have. So, you start giving some radical truths to your coworkers and such. We will be right back. This is Media Cyphers, your only source for political revolution. When we come back, we're going to dive into the big issue of the weekend. That's right. What is going on in Israel, Palestine? We're going to break it down, give you kind of talk about how the media is talking about it and give you a different and more nuanced perspective on this newest upsurge in the conflict. Y'all listening to Media Cyphers only on Wider. Hello again, everybody out there in Radio Land. I'm your host, Andy Argo. You are listening to Media Cyphers. It's a important political and news chat program here on Wider, analyzing things from a working class perspective. If you're just joining us, so I forgot something. So I said we're going to go into the Israel-Palestine story. There is one other really important local story I wanted to hit on. Here in the state of Michigan, I'll give you an update on the UAW strike. There's some really important activity. President Shawn Fain recently gave an update at a recent press briefing, pointedly wearing an "Eat the Rich" T-shirt. As a lefty, I love to see it, folks. Sorry, But I was talking about the decision of workers at Mack Trucks to go on strike. He said, "I'm inspired to see UAW members at Mack holding out for a better deal and ready to stand up and walk off the job to win it," the president said. Some 73% of union members on Sunday voted against the deal with a company that is owned by Volvo Group. The tentative agreement included a $3,500 bonus, a 10% pay after approval of the contract, and a 19% raise over a 5-year contract, Reuters reported. Fain said other issues, including job security, health and safety, and overtime, remain at issue. The union was on strike in 2019 when the contract with Mack Truck ended, resulting in a 2-week strike. There were 3,500 workers on strike in addition to the 46,000 workers on strike against General Motors. The addition of Mack Truck means that UAW now has more than 30,000 members on strike in 22 states. Ooh, yeah. I mean, okay, so I'm not cheering the fact the reason that they have to go on strike. Just to be clear, I am cheering on the fact that workers are standing up for their rights in such impressive numbers. Um, the spirit, summer strikes, the summer of strikes is extending into Striketober, and maybe even a season of Christmas strikes. We'll see. But this has been a very exciting year for the working class, and really asserting itself. I think there was some, I'm taking the long view. I think there was some concern, or maybe just I was a little concerned, shifting from the Trump to the Biden years, that we would see maybe a decline of this type of worker militancy that we were starting to see kind of emerge in those years, thinking back to the Kellogg strike and all that stuff. Oh no, actually that was during the Biden years. My bad. But it seems though, now that workers have gotten a taste of what they can do when they act collectively, it is inspiring all different segments of the working class, from Starbucks baristas to screenwriters to auto workers, to stand up and demand what they are owed from the bosses and the ruling class. And it is a really exciting thing to see. So another big development and a big win for the UAW. General Motors has agreed to place electric vehicle factories under contract, responding to the union's demand for a just transition to electric vehicles. President Shawn Fain said General Motors made the offer after he threatened to call on workers from its Arlington, Texas factory to go on strike Friday. The plant produces profit driving full-size SUVs, including the Chevrolet Tahoe, GMC Suburban, GMC Yukon, and Cadillac Escalade. The plan was to draw down workers at engine and transmission plants and permanently replace them with low-wage battery jobs, Fain said. We had a different plan, and now that plan is winning at GM, he said. We expect it to win at Ford and Stellantis. And it is another thing, like sometimes companies are forced to compete with themselves in a positive way. In this case, now that GM has done this, it puts expectations on Ford and Stellantis to have to step up and make those same assurances. Otherwise, workers might start looking more towards GM. So again, big wins for the UAW and a welcome escalation from workers who are over at over at the Volvo Group / Mack Trucks over in North Carolina. So if you want to read more about that, I was getting some facts and information from the Bridge, Michigan article. UAW strike 2023 update. Mack Trucks strike extends UAW work action, layoffs mount. And that was published on October 9th. Okay, so as I've been saying since the top of the show, it is now time. We're going to talk about the big issue. So I want to kind of start by saying I want to recommend at least one book to everybody out there to give you a much more comprehensive background reading on this long and storied conflict than I could justifiably do in the space of 20 minutes to half an hour. So there is a great book by Arno J. Meyer. It's a little older, so it doesn't talk about the most recent aspects of the Israeli-Palestine conflict, but it does give you perhaps one of the most concise and comprehensive historical overviews I've found of the conflict. It's a book by Arno J. Mayer, Plowshares into Swords, from Zionism to Israel. If you don't have time to dig into a big, hefty book, then my next recommendation for you would be from our friends over at Revolutionary Left Radio. And they've got a great episode. It's about an hour and 40 minutes long, but it gives, again, another really great historical breakdown of, the colonization of Palestine by this, uh, again, without going too much into the historical details, a lot of the founders of Zionism did not have the reactionary right-wing bent that the current government of Israel does, but as we've seen often in history, good intentions and good ideas are often twisted into very ugly versions of themselves. But Rev Left Radio literally just re-released this. It was originally conducted in 2020, but From the River to the Sea, the Palestinian Liberation Struggle. You can find that on Revolutionary Left Radio, which is most podcasting apps. It's also on their website. And we'll talk a little bit about historical context in this article, but again, like I said, there's too much for me to really do a decent job of it just in the space of this radio program. So those are my top two recommendations if you want a primer on the history that has led to what happened over the weekend. So there's a few angles that I want to approach this from, and I'm gonna be citing some experts as I walk through my analysis of this. But it's important to throw out there, first of all, the name of our show is Media Cyphers. And one of the things that we really prioritize is showing how kind of the mainstream capitalist Western media twists things to fit their own agenda, and often leaves out critical context to make you understand or misunderstand a particular political situation. And that is a perfect example of the media coverage that we have seen over the weekend. You tune into CBS, NBC, CNN. It's piece after piece after piece of honing in on the Israeli victims of the recent attacks from Hamas. Now, here's the thing: that is valid. And I mean, I don't think I should need to. It's like, hey, violence is bad, but we also need to have more nuanced analysis of why this violence is happening and all that. So you're basically getting just one side from the Western media, which is the pain that Israeli settlers, let's say that settlers, are experiencing after these Hamas attacks. Some of which are really gnarly and bad. I'm going to talk a little bit about the music festival thing in a sec here. But, and here's a big but. I like big butts, and I cannot lie, and this is a very big but. The people of Palestine and the people of the Gaza Strip did not carry out these attacks for no reason. And we're going to talk about some of these reasons here, because this is really one of the most insidious things that the Western media does. They boil down every conflict to basically, us the good guys, or our allies Israel the good guys, and then the other side are just like these evil boogeymen, like literally like GI Joe villains, who their motivation for doing bad things is because they're evil. They just like doing evil stuff. Again, a lot of this, you saw a lot of this in the War on Terror in the early Bush years, which again, I was as happy as anybody else when Osama bin Laden got killed. But if you look at the manifesto of the people who carried out those attacks, they had reasons. It wasn't just like, ooh, we hate America and democracy and stuff. And the reasons that Hamas has carried out the attacks that they did over the weekend, granted, I get it. I understand, especially a lot of people in our community come from a non-violent political tradition. So carrying out these attacks, it just seems like an anathema to everything you believe in, and to how you've been trying to stand up for the rights of the Palestinian people. I would remind people, we don't live there. We don't live in the Gaza Strip, which is, according to the Human Rights Watch, which is a huge global organization that monitors this type of things. So this is really kind of a centrist, more liberal type of organization. These aren't a bunch of Marxists and stuff like myself. They have deemed what Israel is doing in Palestine, they have turned it into an apartheid state. They've literally said this. Gaza is like an open air prison. Imagine an area around the size of Detroit with 2.5 million people squeezed in, with most of the drinking water, and like it's Flint level style problems. These people do not have freedom of movement. They cannot go in and out of the Gaza Strip. In fact, it's one of the most cynical things that Netanyahu said. This bombing campaign of the Gaza Strip, saying like, "Well, if you live in the Gaza Strips, you should leave. You should evacuate." How are they going to evacuate when your government, your government's military, literally keeps them trapped in there? So, going on to say, the plight of the people in Gaza is very, very real. They have rolling blackouts. They've had escalating attacks from these far right Israeli settlers, which we've talked a little bit about this on the show, but I think I want to kind of bring it up again. So, if you haven't been following the politics of this region as closely as me or other people have, um, Israel's just been taken over by extreme far right government led by Benjamin Netanyahu. The defense minister is literally somebody who was convicted of helping fascist terrorist groups, 10 or 20 years ago, um, who seek the genocide of the Palestinian people, like overtly. Um, and this far right government has just been escalating all of these long-standing problems that people in Gaza have been dealing with because of that very specific and intentional oppression of the Palestinian government. And we can talk about, and we will talk about, Hamas targeting, innocent people, but the Israeli government has been doing that for years. We just over the court, just thinking of the examples of things we've reported on this show. Israeli snipers have targeted medics on the front line helping peaceful protesters. They have targeted, they murdered a Palestinian American journalist about a year and a half ago. A Palestinian child is killed roughly every 3 days in the Gaza Strip by either settler or military friendly fire, or quote unquote friendly fire from the Israeli military. People are systematically harassed. It's like a Jim Crow situation on overdrive. And I say that because imagine like the Jim Crow conditions of the American South, and but Black people are literally walled in to into this tiny little area. So I need my listeners to really understand this, because what we've been seeing from Western media is just a nonstop onslaught. It's like, I support Israel. Government, it needs to. Government currently is pumping more arms and money into the Israeli military, which is already just extremely disproportionate to not only any sort of militant infrastructure Hamas has, but just compared to other countries in the region. And understand that the Palestinian people, we can say violence is not justified, but they have a reason, and they have very good reasons to be angry at the Israeli government. These people are being oppressed. And all I've been hearing from Western media is Israel has a right to defend itself. Israel has a right to defend itself. Well, you know what? Oppressed people have a right to resist. And it's easy for us to sit here in a very, like, the comforts of the American Midwest and say scold from afar like, oh, you shouldn't be doing it that way, you shouldn't be hurting innocent people, et cetera, et cetera. We have not been actively targeted, assassinated, starved, given terrible. I mean, some of us have. Go ask the citizens of Flint. But most of us have never had direct experience with the level of oppression and disrespect and hate that the people of Gaza deal with every single day. Oppressed people have the right to resist. And we're going to be going into some of the history in just a minute to explain that oppression more thoroughly. I do want to kind of throw a few more things out there before we do. Just kind of my own personal observations. So, for those who are still having a hard time really wrapping their heads around this, I want to talk a little bit about the Israeli settler violence that has really kicked up over, especially since Netanyahu took power. But it's a very similar analog to how right-wing groups here in the United States felt empowered under the Trump administration. You had groups like the Three Percenters and the Proud Boys who thought they had the backing of the president and his administration. It turns out that was a one-way street. The president's like, you protect me, but when you get in trouble, I don't care. I mean, because he's Donald Trump. What did you think was going to happen? I digress. But in the same way that those right-wing groups felt emboldened when Donald Trump was president, these same very similar reactionary right-wing groups in Israel feel emboldened when somebody like Netanyahu's in power, when they have a defense minister who's literally palling around with them a few years ago. So I want you to imagine this. So you may remember in the summer of 2020, the Proud Boys came to Kalamazoo. They had their little hate march. They beat some people up, including yours truly. It was very irritating. They did get chased out of town. That was nice. Pretty quickly, too. But imagine this. Imagine the Proud Boys don't just come for an afternoon and drive off with their tail between their legs. Imagine they keep coming back a couple of times a week, just beating more people up, doing more violence, doing more property destruction. Imagine every once in a while they kill somebody. Imagine further that the government says it just turns a blind eye. It's fine that the Proud Boys are going around beating up people in Kalamazoo and killing them, and in fact, the government actually incentivizes the Proud Boys to start stealing people's houses here in the community. So a bunch of Proud Boys show up at your house, say, "Hey, we live here now. You no longer do." Kick you out. You try to do something about it. Said, "Oh, we have a letter from the president that says that this is fine, that we're allowed to do this." I want you to think about that. How long do you think you could live in those conditions and stay peaceful? Not want to lash out? Or even if you are a principled, nonviolent person, how long do you think your neighbors could? Let's do another example. This one's more national. So let's talk about Ukraine. And we've kind of referenced this before in some of our media analysis, like the very different way Western media analyzes the Ukraine-Russia conflict versus, say, this conflict or what's going on, Yemen, or et cetera, et cetera. But what we see is, these are comparable situations here. Russia is the aggressor. They are coming in to invade Ukraine. And granted, look, there's a lot of we talk on the show. There's some problematic forces in Ukraine. We talked about Azov, who are overtly neo-Nazis, but most people could understand, Russia, for whatever reason, invading Ukraine is not okay. Trying to hold their territory is not okay. You can even say like, hey, NATO kind of push them into this aggressive position, but at the same time, you know, invading and holding on to territory of its neighbor, is an act of aggression. Everybody understands that. Most people understand that. Um, and again, it is the Russian and Ukrainian workers who get caught in the middle and have to deal with all of the destruction and death. Now, the Western response to that is to funnel arms and assistance to Ukraine to fight off their aggressors. In some cases, even giving training and arms to aforementioned Azov battalion. Now, what happens when Palestine is backed up into a similar position for a much longer time than Ukraine, by the way? I know there's a deep history, going back to the Donbass and Crimea, but that again is about 10, 15 years old. People of Palestine have been oppressed for 75 years, dealing with the settler colonialism. Conflicts have spouted off and on over the years. And, Hamas at this point, they are explicitly fascist, like, Azov. But but Israel is our geopolitical friend. So because of that, we turn a blind eye to the fact that the people of Palestine have all the same justifications to fight their oppressor, to fight their invader that the Ukraine does. But in this instance, they're the bad guy. Israel are the good guys. We need to stand with Israel. We need to funnel all our money and arms to them. It is a peak bit of hypocrisy, and the rest of the world sees it, especially you see this emerging anti-colonial consensus in Africa. That's a whole different story, but it's very exciting what's going on in Africa right now. But people are are more willing to call out the BS of U.S. empire, and this really is a prime example. In one case where our geopolitical interests align, we're like, solidarity to the people of Ukraine. When it comes to an ally, who in many ways we help set up the gross situation that exists there right now, when it comes to them, it's turning a blind eye to the oppression that the Palestinians deal with and sending thoughts, prayers, money, and guns when the Palestinian people end up fighting back. So with all that said, there's two other things I want to hit on, and you're probably going to see this supercharged. There are a lot of Jewish organizations out there who are putting out more nuanced responses, basically pointing out, this is a sad and terrible thing that's happened, but what did you expect? You put these people under this hammer of oppression for so long. Something was going to have to give. It was going to boil over. There's a great interview with Democracy Now! We're going to read from in just a minute that speaks to that. I'm sure the same old anti-Semitic arguments will be made that you're an anti-Semite if you believe in Palestinian liberation. That is again a misnomer. You can support the people of Palestine without being an anti-Semite, and like I said, there's many Jewish peace organizations and leftist organizations that have that specific line. Don't let the Western media trick you into thinking you're a bigot because you think people shouldn't be oppressed. And I guess one of the last points before I start reading from some of these articles here. So I did want to mention at least probably the worst thing I've seen coming out of the Hamas attacks. There was an attack on a music festival. Said about 300 or so civilians were killed, and I don't want people to think from this broadcast I'm condoning violence, but I do want people to understand the motivations of oppressed people, why they do these things, and so I'm going to start with just a little critique here. I don't think that specifically is not going to do Hamas or the people of Gaza any good. Um, I think an example I can think of that comes to mind, and take this with a grain of salt. I'm a very privileged leftist who grew up in Michigan in the United States playing Nintendo and stuff. So I've never been oppressed like the people of Gaza. So if you hear this and you're like, Andy, shut up. I get it. But just my 2 cents. I think historical examples show that when civilian populations get targeted by groups that are fighting for national liberation, it can often backfire. So the Irish Republican Army is probably a good example. In the 80s and 90s, they did a lot of these kind of uh, like bombings, things like that, which were kind of indiscriminate and who they hurt. And I've heard IRI people reflect on this before. It's like, if you're trying to get the solidarity of perhaps even like people in the British working class who don't agree with the colonial policy of the British government, if their cousin or their friend or their brother or somebody else gets blown up in a burger shop, that's probably not going to cause them to reflect on colonialism. It's probably going to cause them just to emotionally knee-jerk hate the IRA and whatever liberatory project they're engaged in. I feel like they're very much in danger of doing something like that, especially, thinking of Israel is not a monolith. There are progressive people still in Israel who don't agree with what their government is doing to the Palestinians. But things like that have a tendency to cause even progressive people to, run into the arms of some of the most reactionary people in their government. Again, we don't look no further than the United States as a good example of that. After 9/11, even the most progressive people were calling for an attack on Afghanistan. We're rubber stamping whatever the Bush administration wanted to do. Tragedy like that is easily exploitable by the ruling class to gain public consensus for whatever nefarious things that they want to do. So I feel like that may have been like a really big blunder and a really, again, awful thing to happen to those people attending a music festival. And especially, if you're trying to find some sympathy, younger people tend to be more progressive innately. So, it's probably not a good idea to target, um, those specific people. Now, it is worth saying that we need to also analyze this situation from a settler-colonial context, which is to say, you know, uh, the people there adjacent to the Gaza Strip are living on land that belonged to Palestinian people 75, 50, several years ago, so on and so forth, and has been consistently getting gobbled up by these settlers who, and it is worth mentioning, my fiance is much smarter about a lot of this history than I am, but they did mention there are like native Jews in that area who have still lived there, who've managed to live there for generations. But many, 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 many of the people coming to that area right now are very reactionary right wing settlers who are going there specifically to steal and gobble up Palestinian land and eventually try to push them out so they have this right-wing Israeli ethno-state. Now, if you're on the side, if you're growing up in the Gaza Strip or in Palestine and you see a bunch of people throwing a music festival on land that maybe once belonged to your grandfather or your community, that's probably going to make you feel a certain way. And again, I'm not justifying it. I'm going back to this idea that we need to understand that when these bad actions happen, they are not done by GI Joe cartoon villains. There are specific motivations behind them. Sometimes motivations that make sense. There's a bunch of settlers next door throwing a music festival on your grandfather's land. How would that make you feel? I want my listeners to really sit with that so we can understand where these people are coming from. It may not be right, may not be quote unquote justified, but there is a reason behind it. And we should not forget that if the Palestinian people or Hamas felt compelled to engage in this violence, that always comes from an oppressed people feeling like they are backed against the wall and they have no other choice. And again, for years and years and years, the Palestinian people have been engaging in nonviolent resistance. And even though they've gotten more international support and Israel is recognized as a an apartheid state, that's all well and good, but that's basically on paper. The people of Gaza are still suffering. And as I said at the top of the show, oppressed people have a right to resist. So with that, I wanted to read a couple of pieces that at least will give some historical context and maybe explain from people smarter than me what is going on. So this is from an interview conducted on Democracy Now! With historian Rashid Khalidi. Headline is Palestinians living under incredible oppression. It had to explode. And this is from an interview they did yesterday. And just again for context, Israel has ordered a complete siege of Gaza after Hamas broke out of the blockaded Gaza Strip on Saturday, carried out an unprecedented attack by air, land, and sea on Israel. Over the past 3 days, at least 1,300 people have died, including over 800 inside Israel, over 500 in Gaza. And there's what Rashid Khalidi had to say. I'm afraid that the horrific casualties among civilians, Israelis, and increasingly Palestinians is just the beginning of what's going to be an awful, awful, awful massacre in Gaza. The desire for revenge after the killing of a very large number, hundreds apparently, of innocent Israeli civilians is going to lead to a horrific massacre in Gaza of probably many, many, many more people than we can imagine. But I think there are two things that have to be added. This has to be put in context. And the context is not just occupation. The context is settler colonialism and apartheid. The people of Gaza, the refugees in Gaza, originate in the areas where Hamas fighters were attacking in the last couple of days. Those were the Palestinian towns and villages in 1948. The ethnic cleansing of Palestine led to the cooping up of what are now 2.4 million people in Gaza. Today, or yesterday, was Indigenous Peoples Day in the United States. There are indigenous people of the southern parts of Israel that the Hamas fighters were attacking over the past few days. That's the first thing. The second thing, I think what we're about to see is a paradigm shift. The idea that you can coop up 5 million people, put them behind walls, tighten the siege on them, use an eyedropper to allow them some food, some water, some electricity, that idea has exploded as a result of the horrific events of the past 2.5 days. This cannot continue. It's not just a matter of occupation. We have to recognize that you cannot treat entire people the way Israel, not just under this neo-fascist government, but under all its previous governments, has treated them. You cannot expel 750,000 people in 1948 and not expect a return of the repressed. You cannot commit daily violence against Palestinians. One Palestinian has died every day this year, in fact, slightly more in the occupied West Bank. You cannot expect that not to lead to reaction. The reaction will be violent. The reaction sometimes may include things that are unquestionably war crimes. But that kind of pressure put on an entire people over 3/4 of a century will necessarily, inevitably, bring a violent reaction. In this pressure cooker that the Palestinians are in, which the Hamas military commander listed, he said what they're doing in Jerusalem, trying to take over the Al-Aqsa Mosque and turn it into a site of Jewish prayer. What they are doing in the occupied West Bank in terms of the effective annexation of more and more Palestinian land to Israel, and the application of Israeli law to Israelis and military law to Palestinians. Apartheid, two legal systems in one place. The imprisonment of 5,000 Palestinians and the administrative detention of hundreds, and finally, the siege of Gaza. When Yoav Gallant, the Minister of Defense, announced that he was cutting off fuel, food, water, and electricity to Gaza, he called the Gazans human animals. Just a quick aside, that is correct. They are going to be cutting off fuel, food, water, and electricity to Gaza, which is also unquestionably a war crime. That is a violation of the Geneva Convention. That is collective punishment. We are going to punish the actions of Hamas by effectively starving out 2.5 million people, 2.4 million people. Just if you're playing a numbers game, you tell me what's more atrocious. Going on. That's 2.4 million people who are being treated as if they are animals. They're not Hamas fighters. As Raji said, the fighters are one thing. Hamas is one thing. Hamas has imposed itself on the people of Gaza. The people of Gaza are the ones who are going to suffer. As in every one of these wars, almost all of the casualties are going to be civilians that Israel has waged on Gaza. This will be the fifth or sixth attack on Gaza, and I'm very, very afraid that Raji is right. We are going to see unparalleled massacres. But I think we have to see that this may be the end of an era when people in Washington and people in Arab capitals just assumed you could just fly over Palestine, ignore it, and pretend that we're in a new Middle East of peace, while an entire people is living under this kind of incredible oppression in a pressure cooker. It had to explode. Again, if you want to read or watch that full interview, that is on Democracy Now! Historian Rashid Khalidi, Palestinians living under incredible oppression, it had to explode. I want to read one more article from Truth Out. This gives kind of a leftist, more liberatory perspective on what's going on in the Gaza Strip, also highlights some very important historical context. This is from Left Voice. It's written by Mariam Alaniz and Luigi Morris. It's published on October 7th. Headline is Netanyahu and the U.S. prepare bloody counterattack against Gaza Strip. Again, it starts with more details, and I think I've dished those out, but just to put a fine point on it. Those attacks killed over 200 Israelis, took many more hostage. It included the capture of civilians, military personnel, and military equipment. Israel's response was to declare a state of war, dropping bombs on the Palestinian territories, killing at least 200 Palestinians and wounding more than 1,600. Israel's response is likely to escalate to a much more deadly attack, considering its huge military advantages and state-of-the-art weaponry, thanks to the support of the United States and other powers. Early that morning, anti-missile alarms began to sound in various Israeli cities. Images of Palestinians seizing an Israeli army tank and a drone firing at a tank went viral on social networks and were celebrated by the Palestinian people. Hamas forces took control of the Erez military checkpoint at one of the entries to Gaza and other areas near the border. Taking advantage of the situation, Palestinians used bulldozers to tear down a section of the wired fence that restricts the movement of millions of Palestinians who have been living under a fierce siege for decades. The military action launched by Hamas takes place within the context of continuous attacks by the Zionist army, which includes daily murders, tortures, and harassment of the millions of Palestinians, including children, whose territories are occupied by Israeli forces. The year has been the bloodiest year for Palestinians since the Second Intifada in 2000. Before today's airstrikes, 204 Palestinians have been killed, including 37 children, during Israeli military incursions in refugee camps in various cities of the West Bank, by attacks perpetrated by settlers, that's Israelis illegally occupying Palestinian land under the protection of the army, occupying Palestinian villages, as well as Israeli attacks and bombardments on the Gaza Strip. Since the Nakba, which translates to catastrophe in Arabic, in 1948, Israel has been occupying more and more territories as part of the offensive. Today, millions of descendants of the initial occupation live in overcrowded refugee camps with no sight of return. Beyond the forced occupation itself, these refugees in both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are also face constant attacks from the military, the police, as well as ultra-nationalist settlers. Benjamin Netanyahu, who is in the midst of his own domestic crisis, in his first public speech assured citizens of Israel, "We're at war and we will win it." In a video posted on his social networks, he added, "This is not operation or an escalation, but a war." The Israeli government sees this as an opportunity to rebuild its reactionary national unity around the figure of Netanyahu. They are preparing a new massacre as a collective punishment for the Palestinian people in both Gaza, the West Bank, and other occupied territories. Yair Lapid, who leads Israel's opposition, recently met with Netanyahu and said he's willing to put all our arguments aside and establish together with a small professional emergency government. The maneuver serves not only to establish national unity, but also to restore international credibility, as it garners unwavering support from numerous imperialist powers for both his administration and Israel. Netanyahu endorses the attacks against the Palestinian and Arab population in general in order to cater to the ultra-right sectors that support him. Just 10 days ago, on the 23rd anniversary of the Palestinian Intifada, Israel used drones, helicopters, and tanks to attack various Palestinian guard posts and other facilities in the Gaza Strip on the border. Israel launched this offensive because of an apparent Molotov cocktail that was thrown onto an Israeli post during the demonstration. But the real aim of the Israeli army's disproportionate response is to sow fear in the Palestinian population. The attacks and abuses of the Israeli army and the ultra-right government of Benjamin Netanyahu are not limited to missile bombardment or beatings and violent arrests of Palestinians, but include a wider range of oppressive acts. These include closing access to neighborhoods, mistreating the elderly and children, destroying farmland, and more. On September 28th, dozens of settlers vandalized Palestinian graves in the cemetery next to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is of monumental religious importance to Muslim worshippers, as well as a symbol of resistance for Palestinians. 2 days earlier, the Israeli government had ordered the dismantling of the pipes supplying water to the village of Kirbet Emnazal. Again, this is all very important context about why people might get mad at the Israeli government. 2 months ago, a group of more than 700 Israeli and Palestinian intellectuals, academics signed a joint declaration denouncing the Netanyahu government's policies, especially its judicial reform. In the text, they point to Israel as an apartheid regime that subjugates the Palestinian population. They add that the ultimate purpose of the judicial overhaul is to tighten restrictions on Gaza, deprive Palestinians equal rights, both beyond the Green Line and within it, annex more land, and ethnically cleanse all territories under Israeli rule of their Palestinian population. At the first news of the operation launched by Hamas from Gaza and the declarations of the state of war by Netanyahu, the European powers have come out to offer their unconditional support to the state of Israel. Going on, the United States has expressed its unwavering commitment to Israel's quote unquote right to defend itself and has pledged to assure Israel of the means to do so. Our commitment to Israel's right to defense itself remains unwavering, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said. Former U.S. President and presidential candidate Donald Trump also said the same thing, right to defend itself with overwhelming force. I also wanted to mention there's just been some off the wall rhetoric from people in the American political class. There's one from Marco Rubio I wanted to point out that just, it's hard to get surprised these days by some of some of this stuff, but this was just like, wow. Sorry, go where is it? Well, okay, so the essential gist of it um, was Marco Rubio, who some of you may remember as one-time political candidate and all that stuff, running for president. But Rubio basically went on to advocate some very like genocidal rhetoric against the Palestinian people in response to the Hamas attacks. We're seeing a lot of that from Israel as well, advocating basically just firebombing the Gaza Strip. Going on, I just want to kind of read out how this article finishes from Left Voice. For a workers' and socialist Palestine, in which Arab and Jewish people live together in peace. The historic crimes of the State of Israel against the Palestinian people were denounced by several historians, activists, and Jewish intellectuals, including Ilhan Pape. Under the Netanyahu government and the extreme religious right, these crimes have escalated, impacting not only the occupied territories of Gaza and the West Bank, but also against the Arab population living within the State of Israel, who are treated as second-class citizens. For over 7 decades, the Palestinian resistance has confronted this colonial oppression repeatedly. We are on the side of the resistance of the Palestinian people, without suggesting that we share the strategy and methods of Hamas, whose goal is to establish a theocratic state. We defend the right to national self-determination of the Palestinian people, and we stand for a workers' and socialist Palestine in which the Arab and Jewish people live together in peace. And for the record, that is also what this program and I, as its host, advocate. And to put a fine point on it, the blood of both the Palestinian and the Israeli civilians who have been killed over this weekend is on the hands of the Israeli government and the Israeli government alone, who, without their provocative oppression of the Palestinian people, these attacks would not have happened. And you won't be hearing that in the capitalist Western media, but you will be hearing that on media Cyphers. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to have one more story before we close out our show. Y'all listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org, your only source for political revolution. Hello again, everybody out there in Radio Land. I'm your host, Andy Argo, and you've been listening to Media Cyphers. Again, you can find us online if you want to listen to the full episode. We'll have that up on our YouTube page. Also, Media Cyphers Kalamazoo podcast. You can check that out on it. Basically, all podcasting apps except Apple, because it's been like a bureaucratic nightmare trying to get my show on there. But I think we're going to close out today's show. I've got another story here. Yesterday was Indigenous Peoples Day. As more reactionary parts of the U.S. might still celebrate Columbus Day. And there's this article from Truth Out that I wanted to share with all y'all before I close out today's program. It's an article from Amra Solomon. It was published yesterday from Truth Out. It's an op-ed. Dismantling Columbus's legacy requires more than changing a holiday's name. To fight Columbus's violent legacy, we need to engage in radical climate action and reject greenwashing technologies. On September 28th, 2023, a little over a week before Indigenous Peoples Day, and Akamil Odham and Hopi climate activist Jacob Johns was shot by a Trump supporter at a vigil in northern New Mexico, confronting the political support for bringing back monuments of colonizers that had been removed during the 2020 mass movement against racial justice. The community rally was expressing discontent with a monument to Juan de Onate y Salazar, a 17th century Spanish governor of the New Mexican territory responsible for a massacre of Pueblo peoples. Not Christopher Columbus, but the battle over monuments to Onate mirrors the issue of Columbus Day and the question of how to address monuments to genocide and slavery that symbolize investments in white supremacy today. That this question is still answered with violence and the attempted murder of Indigenous people is not surprising. It is also not surprising that the Indigenous victim of racial violence spurred by the monument debate is also a climate activist and environmental protector. But the vapid and tokenizing responses of those who claim to be in solidarity with Indigenous peoples, particularly those in environmental and climate activism, to the deeper issues that the movement to abolish monuments to colonialism raises, is incredibly disappointing, though again not surprising. Going on down further in the article, colonialism is a structure, not an event. Dismantling that structure and creating different relationships with each other requires material actions because abolition and decolonization are not metaphors. When we say we need to end what Columbus stands for, we mean it. But there's a deep resistance in environmental and climate activist circles to embrace even the most basic action that would dismantle the logic of Columbus, which is to support Indigenous refusal of the extraction and desecration of sacred sites, waters, and homelands. Instead, there are calls for consultation without the right to refuse and prevent developmental projects. Environmental activists proclaim leave fossil fuels in the ground while also promoting false greenwashing technologies, such as electric vehicles, that require destroying sacred sites with polluting mining, supporting a new gold rush with the same structure of genocide, talking about elements like lithium that go into electric cars and our phone batteries and things like that. Usually need to be extracted in very messy projects that disrupt the land. Water Justice and Technology, a collaborative multidisciplinary project launching today, digs deep into the ways that climate and water relief policy demands promoted by mainstream environmentalists have been designed through colonial and racist structures, relying on Jim Crow infrastructure and using AI to continue to steal indigenous resources through settler computing to illustrate the material consequences of colonial environmentalism. We directly challenge Green New Deal activists to consider the ways their current platform harms Indigenous, Black, Global South, and frontline marginalized communities and invite them to imagine otherwise worlds and other possible relationships to the environment and each other. Just as the replacement of one holiday by another is insufficient to address the need for justice for colonialism and slavery, the demands currently proposed to tackle the climate crisis are insufficient to address a problem essentially caused by colonial extraction and imperialist development. In our introduction to the Water Justice and Technology website, Theodora Dreyer and I note that as the violence of relief policy can reside in false promises, artificial futures, and perpetual waiting, there are alternatives to giving our time and power away. We look at crisis related mutual aid where some examples of material practices of abolition and delinking from extraction currently reside. But we know it's not enough. The infrastructures that cause climate change and environmental racism need to be dismantled, bypassed, and retired. We must remember that these symbols and holidays represent different sides of ongoing life and death struggles. Tokenizing gestures of inclusion fail. Greenwashing the same old structure of extraction will also fail. Instead, we must ask ourselves, what does Columbus's ship look like today, and how could we sink it? Again, that is an article from Truthout. Headline, Dismantling Columbus's Legacy Requires More Than Changing a Holiday's Name. That's by Amra Solomon. Okay, I think we're about to close out the show. I want to thank y'all for tuning in. Again, we will link all of the resources for the reading and sources cited on our when we publish this on our various websites and such. You can find us in a couple ways. We have a Facebook page, Media Cyphers. We're on YouTube. Put most of our content onto there. And there's also the Media Cyphers Kalamazoo podcast. We put our best content on there for your easy listening on the go, all that good stuff. Shout out to all the folks at Wider for supporting and allowing me to speak these truths on our program. Until next time, keep on fighting for that revolution solution.